stepping up, stepping forward and throwing, and it's caught. And to the 30-yard line goes
Drake May in a clean pocket, looking deep down the sideline, and a leaping grab for Austin Hooper.
Welcome to American Baller, where we focus on all things NFL. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos. Week 10 is officially in the books. This was another crazy week that saw a handful of games come down to the last second, along with some shocking blowouts. Along with breaking down all 14 games from the week, we'll also dive into some of the best performers of the week and who leads the MVP power rankings. Cincinnati Bengals vs. Baltimore Ravens. The week got off to a hot start with a crazy game between the Cincinnati Bengals and Baltimore Ravens in the Thursday night matchup. This AFC North showdown lived up to the hype, with both Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson showing out.
Burrow stepping up,
While it looked like the Bengals had this game in the bag, Baltimore went on a tear in the fourth quarter, scoring 21 points. They came out on top by a final score of 35-34, improving to 7-3, while the Bengals now sit at 4-6. Burrow and Jamar Chase could not be stopped, with Joe throwing for 428 yards and 4 touchdowns, with 264 yards and 3 touchdowns going to Chase. Jackson also showed out.
Jackson floats one. Andrews
throwing for 290 yards and 4 touchdowns. This was a nearly flawless game from both quarterbacks, and a game in which neither one of them truly deserved to lose. New York Giants vs. Carolina Panthers. Kicking off the Sunday games, the New York Giants took on the Carolina Panthers in Germany. While this was another extremely close game, it didn't have the showmanship at the quarterback position that the Thursday night game did. For the Giants, Daniel Jones threw for 190 yards and 2 picks, while Bryce Young threw for 126 yards and a score. The running backs for both teams carried their respective offenses, with Tyrone Tracy Jr. picking up 103 yards and a touchdown on the ground, while Chuba Hubbard rushed for 153 yards and a score. While the Giants wouldn't have been able to take the game without Tracy Jr., he ultimately lost the game for the Giants on a crucial fumble. Carolina came out on top in overtime 20-17. This is a matchup that may end up having major implications on the draft order in the 2025 draft. With this win, Carolina jumps to 2-7, while the Giants are now 2-8 and in very good shape to still clinch the top pick in the draft. New England Patriots vs. Chicago Bears. Moving on to the 1 o'clock slate, we've got the New England Patriots and Chicago Bears. Both offenses couldn't get much going, with Drake May and Caleb Williams combining for 304 yards, a touchdown and a pick. This was a defensive battle for both sides, with the Patriots coming out on top by a final score of 19-3.
Caleb Williams, and in the battle of the number 1 picks.
This was another game that we look back on later in the season as having a big impact on who gets the top pick, with the Patriots improving to a record of 3-7, while the Bears are now 4-5. San Francisco 49ers vs. Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Next up, we've got a matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Christian McCaffrey made his 2024 debut after recovering from tendinitis in both of his Achilles.
McCaffrey out of the backfield makes.
He was rather limited in this matchup, and it was clear that the 49ers were easing him back into things. McCaffrey still had a strong return to action, picking up 39 yards on the ground and pulling in 6 passes for 68 yards. As he continues to work himself back into the game plan, it won't take long until he's once again one of the top performing backs in the league. Brock Purdy had a great game, throwing for 352 yards and a pair of touchdowns.
3rd down and 9, 4-man rush, Purdy far side, that is caught by Jennings.
Baker Mayfield was held in check by the San Francisco defense, throwing for 116 yards and a touchdown. This was a game that came down to the final seconds, with Jake Moody hitting a game-winning field goal as time expired in regulation, giving the 49ers a 23-20 win. San Francisco's uphill battle to get back into playoff contention has begun, as they now have a winning record of 5-4, while the Bucs are now 4-6, clearly missing their wide receiver duo of Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Denver Broncos vs. Kansas City Chiefs. Now we'll take a look at one of the most talked about games of the week, an AFC West showdown between the Denver Broncos and the Kansas City Chiefs. While many believed that the Broncos didn't have a chance of keeping up with the reigning Super Bowl champions in this game, they proved a lot of people wrong. Shockingly, Bo Nix outplayed Patrick Mahomes, throwing for 215 yards and 2 touchdowns to Mahomes' 266 yards and 1 touchdown.
Second down and 9. It's Hunt out of the backfield.
However, once again, the Chiefs did just enough to win the game. This time their narrowest win yet, being forced to block what would have been a game-winning field goal from Denver, coming out on top by a final score of 16-14. This keeps their perfect season alive, giving Kansas City a record of 9-0, while the Broncos are now 5-5. This is by far the craziest win of the season so far from Kansas City, and if things continue breaking their way like this for the remainder of the year, there's a real shot that they could end up being the first team to ever finish the regular season undefeated since the league switched to a 17-game regular season. Buffalo Bills vs. Indianapolis Colts. Up next is a matchup between the Buffalo Bills and Indianapolis Colts. Once again, Joe Flacco struggled as the Colts starter, throwing for 272 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 3 picks. But on the other side, Josh Allen had his first truly bad game of the year, throwing for 280 yards and 2 picks.
Allen fires and he goes to
Jonathan Taylor did what he could to salvage the game for Indy, picking up 114 yards on the ground. However, it wasn't enough, and the Bills came out on top 30-20 despite this very poor showing from their quarterback. But this is the NFL, and a win is a win no matter how ugly. The Bills jump up to 8-2, continuing to look like a true threat to win the AFC, while the Colts now sit at 4-6. Pittsburgh Steelers vs. Washington Commanders. Now we've got another stellar matchup between the Pittsburgh Steelers and Washington Commanders. These two teams have been some of the most surprising this season and have completely silenced the many doubters that they had coming into the year. It appears that the somewhat controversial decision from Mike Tomlin at the time to start Russell Wilson was the right choice. He finished the game with a very strong 195 yards and 3 touchdowns, including a 32-yard dot to Mike Williams that went on to win the game for the Steelers. Rookie quarterback Jaden Daniels had a quiet game, throwing for 202 yards. This was a big matchup for Commanders running back Austin Eckler, who picked up 44 yards and a pair of scores on the ground. But this wasn't enough to win the game, with Pittsburgh coming out on top 28-27.
Have iced it.
Both of these teams are well on their way to a playoff berth, with the Steelers sitting at 7-2, while Washington is 7-3. Minnesota Vikings vs. Jacksonville Jaguars. Next, let's move on to the game between the Minnesota Vikings and Jacksonville Jaguars. Neither team could get a thing going on the offensive side of the ball, and this was an awful showing from both quarterbacks. Sam Darnold has had a bit of a fall from grace after going on an elite stretch early on in the season.
Darnold on the slant.
In this matchup, he threw for 241 yards and 3 touchdowns, while Mac Jones passed for 111 yards and a pair of picks for the Jags. The only touchdown of the game for either side came on a 1-yard rush by Jones. But even with Jacksonville being the only team to find the end zone, they still fell by a final score of 12-7. While this was an extremely ugly win for the Vikings, they still improved to a very strong 7-2 record, while the Jags are now 2-8. Atlanta Falcons vs. New Orleans Saints. Now we've got an NFC South showdown between the Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints. Despite the difference in these two teams' records, this is a game that stayed extremely close from start to finish. Kirk Cousins had an off game, throwing for 306 yards and a pick.
From what they've been doing, Cousins looking to throw. He's got all day. Zips one.
But Bijan Robinson picked up the slack, picking up 116 yards and a pair of touchdowns on the ground. Derek Carr had a strong showing, going for 269 yards and a pair of scores. The Falcons had absolutely no answer for Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who had only 3 catches, went for an insane 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. New Orleans came out on top 20-17 in a crazy upset. They're now 3-7, while the Falcons dropped to 6-4. Tennessee Titans vs. Los Angeles Chargers. Kicking off the 4 o'clock slate is a game between the Tennessee Titans and the Los Angeles Chargers. This game went exactly how you would expect, and the Chargers didn't have to fight too hard for this win. Justin Herbert had a quiet game, only throwing the ball 18 times for 164 yards and a score.
By Herbert and a first down.
Will Levis had one of his better games, finding the end zone twice through the air for 175 yards. Calvin Ridley torched the Chargers defense for 5 catches, 85 yards, and a pair of touchdowns. But this wasn't enough for Tennessee to come out on top, and they fell 17-27. The Titans continue to contend for the top pick in the 2025 draft, sitting at 2-7, and the Chargers keep their playoff hopes alive with a 6-3 record. New York Jets vs. Arizona Cardinals. Now let's move on to the New York Jets taking on the Arizona Cardinals. It appears that even with the addition of Davante Adams, Aaron Rodgers still doesn't have what it takes to turn back the clock and perform as one of the top quarterbacks in the league. The Jets offense couldn't get anything going, struggling for 151 yards through the air. He was completely outclassed by Kyler Murray, who threw for 266 yards and a touchdown while recording only 2 interceptions while also picking up 21 yards and 2 scores on the ground.
It's a Sunday stroll into the end zone. Keep the edge. You've got to keep.
This game was over before it started, and Arizona won 31-6. The Jets' playoff hopes are all but gone, with their record dropping to 3-7, while the Cardinals are in a good position to make the postseason at 6-4. Philadelphia Eagles vs. Dallas Cowboys. Up next, we've got an NFC East matchup between the Philadelphia Eagles and Dallas Cowboys. Without Dak Prescott in the lineup, the Cowboys' offense completely stalled out, finishing the game with an embarrassing 146 total yards. With this rough of a game on offense, it makes it almost impossible to win a game. Jalen Hurts had a strong game through the air, throwing for 202 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick, with 5 catches and 109 of these yards going to A.J. Brown.
Open. That's A.J.
This is another matchup that didn't stay close for long, with the Eagles coming out on top 34-6, giving Saquon Barkley the first win over Dallas in his career. The Eagles are well on their way to being one of the top seeds in the NFC with a record of 7-2 following the win, while Dallas's season is more or less over, now sitting at 3-6. Detroit Lions vs. Houston Texans. Featured in the Sunday night matchup is a game between 2 playoff-bound teams and the Houston Texans and Detroit Lions. Both quarterbacks struggled in this matchup, with C.J. Stroud throwing for 232 yards, a touchdown, and 2 picks, while Jared Goff completed only half of his passes for 240 yards, a pair of touchdowns, and an insane 5 interceptions. This should have been more than enough turnovers for the Texans to easily win the game, but Detroit's defense stepped up in a big way and made it very difficult for Houston to take advantage of ideal field position time and time again. This game came down to the wire, with Jake Bates barely sneaking in a 52-yard field goal to give the Lions a 26-23 win. The Lions could end up taking the top seed in the NFC, with their record now being 8-1, while the Texans don't have much competition in winning the AFC South with a record of 6-4. Miami Dolphins vs. Los Angeles Rams. In the Monday night game, the Miami Dolphins took on the Los Angeles Rams. A similar trend in many of the games this week, both teams struggled offensively in this matchup. However, the Dolphins got a much-needed win, taking the game by a final score of 23-15. However, with a 3-6 record, they'll have to have an almost perfect second half of the season to make the postseason. LA falls to 4-5, and it'll be very interesting to see how the front office goes about constructing their roster moving forward, with the team featuring aging veterans at many key positions. Players of the Week. Joe Burrow led the league in passing yards this week in an insane Thursday night showing, throwing for 428 yards in the Cincinnati Bengals' 35-34 loss to the Baltimore Ravens. Chuba Hubbard put the Carolina Panthers on his back in the Sunday morning matchup in Germany, rushing for a league-leading 153 yards in his 20-17 overtime win over the New York Giants. On the back of the elite day from Burrow, Jamar Chase led the league in receiving yards with a mind-blowing 264, making up over 60% of the Bengals' receiving yards. Finally, with the New York Jets offense not being able to do much in their matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, Jamie and Sherwood and the defense offense spent a good chunk of the game on the field. He made the most of this, recording a league-leading 17 tackles, 7 of them being solo and 10 being assisted. MVP leaderboard. With another week in the books, the MVP race has become a lot clearer, and it's realistically looking like a 3-man race. The player clearly in first place is Lamar Jackson. He put on a show against the Bengals, passing for 290 yards and 4 touchdowns while leading a fourth-quarter comeback to win 35-34. Despite having an awful game in Week 10, Josh Allen still sits in second place. While he was horrendous through the air, throwing for 280 yards and 2 picks, he was able to rush for 50 yards and a touchdown and lead his team to a 30-20 win over the Colts. Finally, coming in third place is Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes had another game that fell well below the standard he set for himself, throwing for 266 yards and a touchdown. But he led the Chiefs to another win, and that's the sole thing keeping him in this race. If Kansas City makes history as the first team to ever have a 17-win regular season, it'll be very tough for voters not to give Mahomes his 3rd MVP. Thank you for tuning in to American Baller. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos.